very much for accepting our invitation to come to this presentation of cheese factories of Door County. My name is Don Rudolph. I'm president of the Sevastopol Historical Society, and I've been interested in cheese factories ever since I was a little kid. When my dad would take me on the corner of Dunn Road and Highway 42 and say, you know, there used to be a cheese factory there. And just about every time we'd go to that intersection, he'd say, you know, there used to be a cheese factory there. Until I got sick of hearing about it. But here I am now. I'm the one that's telling my son that all the time. You know, there used to be a cheese factory on this corner. Anyway, I'd like to start out by saying this presentation will be viewable at doorbell.net/video. It'll also be on Charter Channel 986 on Sunday at 7 p.m. and repeated regularly thereafter. We'd like to thank Door Artisan Cheese for donating some of our cheese snacks, also Renard's Cheese Factory. And speaking of donations, our organization runs on donations, so please remember to hit the donation basket when you're enjoying your cheese and cheese snacks. Starting with the settlement of Door County, this is some of the history that a lot of people don't ever take into consideration. The first generation of farm settlers was approximately 1860 to 1890, and their first prerogative was clearing the land, immediate imperative in order to have something for them to eat, something for their livestock to eat. Typically when they moved here to Door County, it was forested wilderness. Basically, there was no available land for clearing and plowing and planting crops until it was cleared, all by hand. They had to cut timber, pull stumps, pick and pile stones as soon as possible in order to get a crop in the ground. And they struggled to produce enough feed, food, and fuel to survive the oncoming winter. One of the things that they always say about the European people that moved here is they were always afraid of the winter. Winter was so long and they had to store up enough to get through, to keep from starving to death and to keep from freezing to death. And that's what made the work ethic. And typically they build log structures with materials at hand. The second generation of settlement was approximately 1890 to 1920, and it comprised continually land clearing activity. And I remember my dad saying that they considered the woods to be their enemy. They had to continually beat the woods back and clear more land in order to produce crops that would bring in cash money. Second generation, typically log buildings were replaced by sawn lumber construction methods. It got to the point where living in a log cabin was looked down upon because that was old-fashioned and that was the previous generation. Diversified incomes sources were fishing, lumber mills, logging, stone quarries. Anything to bring cash in to try to pay the bills and pay the property taxes. Diversified farming enterprises were horses, pigs, chickens, hay, wood, milk production for butter and cheese, and sometimes fresh milk. Cash was needed to pay for the machines of mechanization of farming and family living needs. Dairy farming and cheese production was a low-cost, simple process using few inputs to manufacture a nutritious protein source. And small-scale dairy farming could be done by the women and children, typically while the men were away fishing or working in the logging industry. Now, something I'd like you to keep in mind is the economics behind the scenes, which explains a lot of the turnover and a lot of the mergers and a lot of the concentration in the industry. First off, there was the panic of 1893 when a lot of the banks closed. A lot of mortgages were called. A lot of people got into trouble and lost their businesses. The second thing was the pea bonanza of 1895 to 1915. And most people probably don't know it here, but Door County was almost the pea capital of the world. Because of the climate, because of the fact that peas had never been grown here before. There were two big pea canning factories that one of them was the Reynolds brothers, which many of you have probably heard of. They originally started in the pea canning business before they switched to fruit canning production. There was even 2 pea warehouses where pea seed was sorted and picked through during the winter by women, and it was used to send all over the United States for growing peas. And the reason it stopped in about 1915 was people continued to grow peas after peas after peas on the same land, and they ended up with a pest called a pea louse that was devastating to the industry, and also they got thistles, and it got so bad that they would grow more thistles on their land than they could grow peas, and that was pretty much the end of the pea industry. Then there's the parity years of 1910 to 1914, which is what the USDA used to gauge how farmers had done compared to those years, because those were the years where farming was considered to be excellent and the returns from farming were the same as the urban economy. Then there's World War I, which boosted the rural economy because there was a shortage of food all over Europe, and we were exporting food products. 1917, and I'm not going to tell you about 1917 until later on in the program, but that is a pivotal year in the history of the cheese business. The mini depression of 1920 and 21, the Great Depression of 29 to 39, World War II, and the after-war boom years of 45 to 50. And all of these events were in conjunction with continual industrialization and concentration in the farming industry. Why make cheese? The simple answer is it's a simple, easy process to store protein long term. And what about butter? Factories that produced butter were called creameries. In the early days, cheese factory and creameries were independent of each other. As time went on, many factories installed equipment to be able to produce both cheese and butter depending on what was most profitable at the time. Washington Island Dairy being a good example of this practice. The process of cheese making is relatively simple. There's 4 main ingredients: heated milk, a bacteria culture, the rennet enzyme, and salt. These 4 ingredients are manipulated by a talented cheesemaker to produce hundreds of different types of cheese varieties. The first cheese factory in Door County was opened by Joseph Alsberger in July 1882. He was also the first person to own 2 factories. His first factory was 2 miles north of Forestville on Highway 42. And also, I don't know if you're familiar with downtown Maplewood, but there's an old general store right in the corner with an old steel siding on it. That was owned by Joseph Alsberger and run by him for about 20 years, and the sign is still on the corner of the building. The second factory was Alfred Bushman in 1884 at Forestville Corners. From 1885 onward, cheese factories rapidly multiplied. Early cheese factories typically were small buildings, had small cheese-making outfits, and a small workforce, often the husband, wife, children, along with a licensed cheesemaker. They featured wood-fired vats, which later became fired by steam boilers. Some factories in conjunction with a prosperous farm, some factories were in conjunction with a rural store, and some factories were standalone. And these are just some of the articles in the local press. Cheese factory outfits for sale are Meyer and Anderegg from Anape, Algoma, Wisconsin, were consultants that you could hire to set up a complete setup. The Wagner vat, the famous vat from Manitowoc County, and the Tifton Hay vat from the Tifton Hay hardware store downtown Sturgeon Bay was actually manufactured right in Sturgeon Bay. First dairying in Door County was pasture-based and grass-dependent. Rain, rain, rain. always dependent on the rain, always begging for rain. It seems that there was always a drought in Door County. There was always an initial flush of milk in May and early June from the first grass, and if it didn't rain after that, then the milk pretty much died off. And at that time, the best hay was reserved for the horses because the horses were much more important than the dairy cattle. Dairy cows dried up in the fall and calved in late spring, usually in May when the grass was starting to grow, followed by the June flush, they used to call it. Advanced milk production. Alfalfa was introduced, which was stored protein. Ground grains were fed, which was also stored protein and energy, which allowed the cows to milk all year round and produce more milk. Silos were introduced, which stored energy. Greatly improved dairy genetics. In the first cattle herds, some of the cattle were used for oxen. And you can imagine that the oxen type genetics didn't produce very much milk. Advanced milk production also was helped by greatly improved barns built specifically for dairying. If you'll notice, many of the barns in Door County, especially the big ones, weren't specifically built for dairying. They were built for holding crops that were threshed in the fall or the winter, peas being an example, or they were built to hold hay, and in the winter time people would come around and bale hay, and then that hay would be sent out on the train from Sturgeon Bay, or it would be sent from Schutewer's dock on ships over to Marinette to feed the horses that were used for logging in the Upper Peninsula logging camps. Cheese factories were open all year round when there was enough milk, and farm site factories either evolved or closed. Cheese production practices. The cheesemakers always said good milk makes good cheese. Good farmers produce sweet, clean milk. Bad farmers produce sour, unsanitary milk. And I had a question a couple of months ago at another presentation. The lady said, what would you consider to be unsanitary milk? And told her about a story I had from a cheesemaker in Manitowoc County, third generation cheesemaker who lives in his grandfather's cheese factory and has it restored like it was in the 1930s. And he said, you could imagine my surprise when I was pouring out a can of milk and a drowned cat came out. So that would be a good example of unsanitary milk. Watered milk. The cheesemaker in Gardner was complaining that when he was screening the milk, the minnows were coming out of it. So apparently the farmer had stopped in by the creek and had added some creek water to the milk cans. Good cheesemakers were honest, talented, dependable, and sanitary people that had to work 7 days a week. And there was also bad cheesemakers who were dishonest, undependable, unsanitary. Credible amount of turnover in ownership and cheesemakers. Cheese factory owners, individual farmers, investors, country store owners, cheesemakers, farmer cooperatives, Polly and Polly, a cheese brokerage from Green Bay, and even organized crime got into the cheese business in Door County. Cheese factory longevity. Any guesses to how short and how long cheese factory were in business? "7 days to 115 years. What about whey? Have you eaten your curds and whey today? For every 10 pounds of milk, you get 1 pound of cheese and the rest is whey, which means that there's 9 pounds of waste product per plus wash water to get rid of. Typically delivered back to the farm to slop the hogs, mixed with ground feed. Sometimes dumped in the swamp, later land spread, Whey cream separators were invented to take the whey protein out of the whey, that you were able to increase the efficiency of the manufacturing process and sell another product. And whey was a continual headache for cheese factory operators. A lot of times cheese factories were forced to shut down because they had no place to go with the whey. And it was being dumped into the creek or dumped into the land, and rotting whey doesn't smell very good. So now I'm going to go through some of the cheese factories that I've been able to identify, starting with the town of Union. Everard Brothers, 1887 to 1897 on their farm in Namur. Mrs. Pierre DeCamp, who operated a saloon, a store, a cheese factory, 1887 to unknown. Oliver D. Bush Sr., 1896, location unknown. William Struck, the clay soil factory, 1906 to 1916, on the Brussels Union town line at Delphos's Corners. And the Union Cheese Factory, Gaspard Martin, 1908, location unknown. This is a picture of the clay soil cheese factory operated by William Struck, later turned into a store. Then William Struck in 1916 built a Fairland store and cheese factory, which was sold to Louis Fontaine in December of 1919. It was operated as a farmer cooperative until the mid-50s. And that's the store and the cheese factory right in Namur. Red River Union Factory, 1920 to approximately 1935 on the Door-Kewanee County line. And that's what it looks like today. Town of Brussels. Pierre Verley and Company, 1890 to 1958, 1/2 mile south of Brussels, later became the Brussels Dairy Company. Gabe Pierre Art Klessig Cheese Factory, 1907, burned March 1941, located near the Brussels High School. Alex Flamal Factory, 20 feet by 40 feet, 1910 to 1914, northwest corner of Mazare, became the Farmers Cheese and Creamery Company. Eugene Nazi, 1890 to 1901 on the county line of Rosaire. Silver Creek Dairy in Tornado, 1914 to 1921, and the Hagley Factory, 1892 to 1899, 1/2 mile west of Kohlberg. Herman Schlussel, 1.5 miles east of Kohlberg, 1892 to 1896. Victor Brands, 1/2 mile east of Rosaire, 1885 to 1935, later became the Frank Gillett Store and Cheese Factory. Conrad Guth, Creamery and Cheese Factory of Kohlberg, 1897. For many years, the largest dairy factory in Door County, later became a farmer cooperative, then owned by Donald Koss from Algoma, closed in the late 60s. Otto Karnitz Cheese Factory, 1904 to unknown, at Clawhammer Corners. Anybody know where Clawhammer Corners is? The Southern Door County Shop and Eckert's Antiques, that corner is Clawhammer Corners. This is a picture of the cheese factory at Kohlberg. Still exists. That's the cheese factory and store operated by Otto Karnitz, Clawhammer Corners. And just some excerpts from the local papers. Town of Gardner, August Bossman Factory, 1892, located in Section 9. Hagel and Schlissel, 1892, which became Julius Schwitzenberg's factory, 1900 to 1903, which later became Guth's factory, 1904 to 1919. That was located on County C, right behind Jiggo's store. I don't know if anybody remember Jiggo's store. That's where we always went to get beer when nobody else would sell it to us. Maple Dairy Company, which was kitty corner from Guth's factory, 1919 to 1963. Henquin at Girondale Cheese Factory, 1892 to 1914 on County C. Gardner Dairy Company, 1914 to 1951, County C. Charles and Ralph Jenquin became Door County Dairy, 1893 to 1973 on County C. That's the Jenquin Door County Dairy Cheese Factory, still exists. Notice it's got the stone foundation, which is very common in cheese factories. Town of Forestville, Joseph Alsberger, 1882. First cheese manufactured in Door County. Albert Bushman, 1884 to 1885, burned down. Rudolph Buchholz, 1886 to 1897, owned several cheese factories in the town of Forestville. August Bussey, 1888 to 1896, on County H, west of Maplewood. William Getz Cheese Factory and Creamery, 1889 to 1914, half mile west of Maplewood. Joseph and William Getz Cheese Factory and Store, 1889 to 1914, Section 3, just off County Trunk O. John Borman Cheese Factory, 1889 to 95 in Carnot. H.J. Teskey Store and Creamery, 1895 to 1920 in Carnot. The Sloan Faken Schley Koss Cheese Factory, 1905 to 1976, Forestville's east side. That actually became the Badger State Dairy, and that was the one that the mafia was involved in. One night the cheese and all the equipment just disappeared, and all the farmers' checks bounced. Then there was the Wolski Dairy, 1907 to 1958, 1 mile east of Forestville, on the corner of O and J. Gold Leaf Dairy, 1882 to 1953, between Maplewood and Forestville on Highway 42. Later became the Empey's Eggs. Then there was the Nelsonville Farmers Co-op Cheese Factory, 1905 to 1917. Anybody know where Nelsonville is? It's about 4 miles south of Sturgeon Bay on East Maplewood Road. There used to be the S&T Country Store, big white building, and right next to it was the Nelsonville Farmers Co-op. That's the Gold Leaf Dairy, the location of Joseph Alsberger's first cheese factory on Highway 42 between Forestville and Maplewood. And that's the Nelsonville store, and right next to it was the Nelsonville Cheese Factory, which was torn down and added on as an addition onto the store. Town of Claybanks, Madosh and McDermott Cheese Factory and Store, 1886 to 1917 in Slolona. Notice that date, 1917. Matheson and Nygaard Cheese Factory and Store, 1889 to 1963 in Vignes. And the Rosewood Dairy and Store, which is now Renard's, 1905 to present on County Road S in Algoma. And this picture says, farmers from Brussels and the surrounding area deliver milk to Rosewood Dairy on what it today is known as County S. Well, that's definitely a lie, because farmers from Brussels would not drive their milk all the way to Rosewood Dairy. That's why there was a cheese factory every 2 miles. So that's just a misstatement. Today, Rosewood Dairy is operated as a cheese plant by the Renard family. And that's what it looks like today. And that's the store in Vignes, and the first cheese factory was in the back of this store. And eventually a new cheese factory was built across the road, which is no longer standing. Town of Sturgeon Bay, F.A. Krieger Cheese Factory, 1890 to 1898, County Road S, just a mile and a half south of Sturgeon Bay. Adam Brink, Clover Cheese Factory, 1903 to 1917. There's that 1917 number again. County Road S, which is the present site of Weber Automotive. The Central Cheese Factory, 1906 to 1917, burned mysteriously in 1921 near the Mount Olive Church. And Dr. Humke's Cheese Factory, 1916 to 1917 at Berger's Corners, 1.5 miles south of Sawyer on County U. The cheese factory of Frank A. Krieger, Sturgeon Bay Town, was destroyed by fire. The loss will reach $300 with no insurance. As the factory has not been in use for a time, the fire was undoubtedly of incendiary origin, which means it was arson. Town of Nassawapi, John Shinkton Cheese Factory on his farm, 1885 to 1900 on the Little Sturgeon Road, which is County C. Charles Stokes Ginger Cheese Factory store, 1888 to 1905 at Stokes Corners. Herman Ninus Cheese Factories, 1896 to 1901 in Stokes and Tornado. Gindra's new factory, 1906 to 1917, reopened again until 1940 at Stokes Corners. And the John Lightsky Factory, 1904 to 1937 on C&MM, which was later known as the Idlewild Cheese Factory, Ernest Krieger owner. And that's what it looks like today. And interestingly enough, if you're looking from the road going south, the road is moved over to the side to miss the cheese factory. And on the deed it says, all land east of the creek. Well, the creek is right where that LP tank is, right on the corner. So they had to move it east of the creek just to get it in that location. Again, in the town of Nassawapi, the Gullickson Tenner Cheese Factory, 1903 to 1906. George Tenner's new cheese factory, 1906 to 1908. I haven't been able to find the location, but I know it's 20 by 40 by 12 feet tall. One story near the site of the old one. Ellis Brothers Cheese Factory. Ellis was next to Toggy's Tavern, which is the Stage Road Inn. 28 by 40 of stone and brick construction. That building burned in 1976. Nassawapi Dairy Company Cheese Factory, 1906 to 1917. New Settlement Road. Dr. Humke's Pleasantville Factory, 1916 to 1917 on County Road C on the corner of the airport. Cloverleaf Dairy Company Cheese Factory, 1907 to 1974. Started as a 22 by 40 building, 2 stories high on land donated by the Fronda family. There's a picture of the Nassawapi Farmers Co-op Cheese Factory on Settlement Road. Just like it looked probably 30 or 40 or 50 or 75 years ago. Notice the stone first story. That's a Cloverleaf Dairy. That's what it looks like today. Town of Sevastopol. Lansing R. Stevenson Cheese Factory was the first one, 1889 to 1894, on Highway 57 east of 42, located on Mark and Mary Stevenson's farm. Frank Simon, 1889 to 1890, location unknown but described on the former William Bassford farm. Joseph Nussi Cheese Factory, 1891 to 1899 on Forest Road. Vakes and Weiderman Cheese Factory, 1891 to 1917 in Voseville, later called Valmy, later named the Morning Glory Factory. Fred Kepler, 1893, southwest corner of 42 and Dunn Road, 1 year only. Fled the county, the building burned down by arson. Took the cheese and the farmer's money along with him. Hope nobody's related to Fred in here. The Bassford Cheese Factory, 1894 and burned in October 1917. northeast corner of 42 and Dunn Road. It was 28 by 50 with a meeting hall and dance floor above. It was quite the community gathering for weddings, dances, church services. Washburn Cheese Factory, 1894 to 1917. Factory number 1 located in the corner of Whitefish Bay and Matthew Road, later known as the Cherry Leaf Factory. Peter Groff Cheese Factory, 1895, burned in April 1941 on the southeast corner of Clarks Lake Road and Bechtel Road, later known as the Whitefish Bay Cheese Factory. Washburn Cheese Factory number 2, 1902 to 1917, 1918 to 1919, later became known as the Cedar Creek Factory. Institute Cheese Factory, 1907 to 1909, located at the Institute store. Next Institute Cheese Factory, 1912 to 1917, reopened again in 1919 to 1921, built by Henry Gerlach on Highway 57. The Vakes Maratic Cheese Factory, 1911 to 1917, 1919 to 1920, at Ed Henschel's Corner on Country View and Town Line Road. George Robinson Cheese Factory, 1915, northeast corner of Matthew and County T, was 18 by 36, one story, known as the Fairview Factory, and that's on the corner of the Gilbert Farm. That was still standing when I was a child. Eagle Valley Cheese Factory Association, 1916 to 1917, later became the Golden Glow Cheese Factory, 1919 to 1951, last run by Howard Renard, corner of Town Line and Matthew Road. And the Wayside Cheese Factory. Anybody know where Wayside is? Mill Supper Club, Scandia. That was known as the Village of Wayside. Run by Otto Lauser. And an interesting story on Otto Lauser. He got into a car accident on the old toll bridge in Sturgeon Bay. And they both got out and checked their cars, and they thought they were in good shape, and they drove off. And the guy who he hit had a broken tie rod on his Model T. And the car went right into the water, and he drowned in 17 feet of water. 10 years later, Otto was in a fatal car accident on the curve going out of Valmy. And that's the Institute Cheese Factory as it looks today. Notice the stone foundation. And that's the Golden Glow, an old Sevastopol landmark, and you can tell it's a cheese factory. Anybody know how? Big chimney, made for a big boiler. Stevenson's Cheese Factory started up 2 or 3 weeks ago, and nearly 1,000 pounds of milk are received daily. The proprietor is paying 60 cents per hundredweight for milk, and he hopes to do a little better than this if the farmers will only patronize the factory more liberally. The institution should be encouraged by all who have the welfare of Sevastopol and the county at heart. Town of Egg Harbor, John Warchek Cheese Factory, 1892, location unknown. John Bunda Cheese Factory, 1896, burned in 1898 along with 2 hotels in Egg Harbor. Big fire. Wilson Creamery, 1911 to 1914, across from the Egg Harbor blacksmith shop. The Bassford Brothers Cheese Factory, 1904 in Carlsville, which was only in business for 1 year and became a blacksmith shop. Joseph Eichinger Cheese Factory and Store, 1905 to 1917. That was the store in Carlsville. Actually became Art Klessig's, and then William Urban's. Joseph Weirig's Cheese Factory at Sunny Point, 1915 to 1952, became the Sunny Point Dairy Company. Joseph Weirig's then built a cheese factory in the middle of Egg Harbor on Memorial and Farview Road. Door County Artisan Cheese, 2017 to present on Highway 42 north of Egg Harbor. Actually manufacturing cheese again in a new place in Door County. That's a picture of Joseph Weirick's cheese factory, the second one he built in the town of Big Harbor, a residence today. And that's Door County Artisan cheese. Town of Jacksonport, Bly and Anschutz Cheese Factory, June 1890, at Wilson's Corner. Became Fred Hansen's Creamery in 94, became Abel Limbert's factory in 1898, became Joseph Bagnall's factory in 1899, became Art Miller's factory in 1913, became George Robinson's factory 1917 to 1935. Lemire and Erskine, 1893, a short distance south of Jacksonport on the corner of Highway 57 and Jordan's Lane. And the Lakeside Cheese Factory store, 1910 to 1917, Richard Lehman and William Struck, right in downtown Jacksonport, where the park is right now. Maple Leaf Factory, 1912 to 1926, in the southeast corner of Highway I and T. John Tyke built it. Maple Leaf Farmers Association, Fred Walters, later became Matt Peffer's store and factory in 1921. Abner Calhoun Mashik Pepper Factory and Store, 1901, burnt in 1921, corner of V&T in West Jacksonport. And the West Jacksonport Dairy, built in 1925, burned in 1952, was a farmer cooperative. Then Art Miller was the proprietor and cheesemaker. And that's the cheese factory on the left side when Matt Peffer owned the property. And that's the cheese factory today. It was originally right in the edge of the road. Town of Bailey's Harbor, J.W. Kinzel Cheese Factory, 1889, bought by Henry Pleck. And Pleck is a familiar name in Sturgeon Bay, dairy industry. 1892. Bought by Torger Torgerson in 1896 and moved west of Kangaroo Lake. Torger Torgerson is in jail August of 96 for absconding from a $200 note. Henry Pleck Cheese Factory, 1890, located 4 miles north of Bailey's Harbor. Bought by John Warachek in 1892. Peninsula Center Store and Factory, which was Washachek's, 1909 to 1949, currently PC Junction. And the Clearview Cheese Factory, 1926 to 46, 1.5 miles south of Peninsula Center on A. And this is a picture of the West Jacksonport Dairy, 1933. Dennis Dietrich brought it in. That's his dad, Reinhold Dietrich, who was the cheesemaker. He was paid $30 a month, and they wanted to reduce his salary to $25, and he said, no, I'm going to quit. So they kept it at $30. That building burned in 1952 when they put a new boiler in. This is Washachek's Store and Cheese Factory, Peninsula Center. And that's the cheese factory south of Peninsula Center, the rising sun on. Town of Gibraltar, Anderson Cheese Factory and Store, 1891 to 1905, right in Ephraim. Juddville Cheese Factory, 1917 to 1928. H. Max Wilson built it. Maple Grove Cheese Factory, 1917, burned 1943. Southeast corner of F and Maple Grove Road. And Max Wilson built that one as well. The Ephraim Creamery, owned by C.S. Smith, 1912 to 1916. This is the Juddville Cheese Factory. Now it's a chiropractic center right in the corner of 42 and Juddville Road. Town of Liberty Grove, Wenzel Bunda's factory, 1890. Probably heard of the Bunda factory. Used to have a store in Sturgeon Bay and Sister Bay, well-known merchants. Farmer's Cheese Factory, 1891 to unknown, northeast corner of section 33 near Sequist Farm. Captain Albert Ickey Cheese Factory, 1893 to 1901 in Ellison Bay. Archie Wiltsey Cheese Factory, 1893. We believe that he bought the Farmer's Cheese Factory. Not sure about that. Liberty Dairy, 1917 to 1930. Herman Grassi, proprietor. formerly a school 1/2 mile north of Q and 57 in the German settlement. This is the Appleport Cheese Factory, William Evers. That was torn down a few years ago. Liberty Grove Dairy Company in Appleport. Otto Vake's Cheese Factory and Store, 1917 to 1930 on Letty's Corner on ZZ. Melvin Kramer Cheese Factory, 31 to 34, corner of Old Stage and Wildwood Road. Negrassi Kramer Cheese Factory, 1935 to 36, right in Sister Bay, which is currently Grassi's Grill. And that's Grassi's today, and that's what it looked like in the 30s. Melvin Kramer's Cheese Factory, July 1st, 37, burned down July 8th, 37. Highway 57, south of Sister Bay. Ellison Bay Cheese Factory, 1916 to 1920. Ed Evenson was the owner. Ed Delcourt from Sevastopol was the cheesemaker. And an interesting thing about that is, oh, you'll see in the next slide or two. Pinecone Cheese Factory, 1919 to 1921 in Newport. Sister Bay Creamery, 1907 to 1913, owned by Matt Razor. And the Door County Creamery, 2013 to the present, specializing in goat cheese. This is Liberty Grove Dairy on 57 and Q. Anybody recognize that picture? Gus Klenke's garage. Gus Klenke was actually a cheesemaker, went to Ellison Bay from Southern Door to make cheese, and he turned it into a garage. That's the Newport Cheese Factory. You can't really tell it from the picture, but notice that the first story is stone walls again. And that's the Sister Bay Creamery. Town of Washington, Washington Island Cheese Factory Association, 1896 to 1901 at Detroit Harbor. Charles Jess and Company, 1892 to 1901, Washington Harbor. Washington Island Creamery, 1916 to 1925. Washington Island Dairy Company, 1925. Andy Justinger was the manager. They made butter, cheese, and fluid milk from 45 herds of dairy cows in Washington Island. Just imagine 45 herds of dairy cows. Almost more in Washington Island than there is in the county at this time. In May 1949, the old factory burned down and a new factory is built. Washington Island Co-op Dairy buys the factory in '59 from Andy. 1968, they vote to close the factory, and the last dairy herd on the island was 1972. The building is now the Lavender Company. Okay, 1917, Van Camp's pea cannery switches to condensed milk. Van Camp's receives a government contract to supply condensed milk for the war effort. Van Camp's pays significantly more money for milk. As a matter of fact, milk was going for about $1 a hundred, and Van Camp's started paying $2 a hundred. Van Camp's also has a fleet of trucks to pick up the milk. Up until that time, farmers had to deliver their milk to the local cheese factory. An article from the paper says, 11/22/17 says the condensery added 4 new trucks to their outfit. January 31st, 1918, there are only a couple operating cheese factories within a 15 or 20 mile radius of the condensery. In 1917, there were 35 cheese factories operating in the Door County, and almost all of them were put out of business instantly. I think I should mention some other dairy enterprises, fluid milk producers. Henry Overbeck's Bonnie View Farm on 8th Avenue, the house and the shed still are there. They used to produce fluid milk for Sturgeon Bay and also cottage cheese. Fred Ash's Oakland Dairy on Dunn Road, just a couple miles west of here. Chester Jarman's Rolling Hills Dairy on Matthew Road. Lawrence Wickman's Diamond Dairy on Highway 42. Jacob Miller's Dairy west of Evergreen Nursery. And there was the Plex Ice Cream and Dairy Plant, 1924 to 1958, right in downtown Sturgeon Bay, that had fluid milk and also made ice cream, and also bottled Pepsi-Cola. So if you have any questions whatsoever, I'd be happy to entertain them. Chuck?
Don, why do you think, I realize they're burning wood in there, but why do you think there were so many fires?
Well, in 1917, there were several fires because no way else out. I think it's hard to overestimate the effect that the condenser had on the cheese factories. It just killed them. They were just out of business. And I imagine they had mortgages on some of them. There was a gentleman from Maplewood by the name of Louis Jarko who owned 5 factories. 1917, lost them all. So, and it seems like at the turn of the century, many of the fires are of suspicious origin. And I'm not saying self-arson, but arson. People that were upset would light somebody's business on fire. There was quite a few cases of that. And then you get to the 30s and 40s, people are putting in bigger boilers for more capacity, more efficiency. And I was told many of these didn't have the chimney capable of handling that intense heat. And for instance, the one in Maple Grove, new boiler was put in and 6 days later it burned down. So that's my explanation. Yes?
Did I understand that you said there were like in the early 1900s, there were approximately every 20 miles, how many miles apart were the cheese factories?
Typically 2.
And then how much did they produce then? Or where did they market what they produced?
Well, there were several brokerages. There was Algoma Produce Company, there was a Straubel Company.
So then they'd ship them out further.
And they would, raw cheese had to be kept for 60 days. Polly and Polly was another cheese broker. And they were more than brokers. They provided financing. Sometimes they took the factory over in case the cheesemaker got in trouble. There was a lot of under the table dealings. Some of the cheesemakers would finance cows for farmers, so they would have to produce their milk there, and then they would always talk about getting cheated on their test, and just a lot of machinations in the whole industry. Yes, sir?
There's nothing there about the Brussels cheese factory back in the 50s.
Which one are you talking about?
Well, it used to be across from Wilford Vandertide.
Wilford Vandertide, Brussels Dairy Company. That was originally the Pure Verley cheese factory.
Because Wilford Retzloff was a cheesemaker.
Do you have any idea what year that went out of business?
No, but my dad used to pick up milk there.
Isn't that where the Lardnoy family house is right now?
Yeah, yeah. And then Francis and Mary Shidwell had a store next door.
Okay, thank you.
And John Monfalls had a blacksmith shop. They were all close together. Just south of Brussels, on County Seat.
Any other questions?
The reason I know that because when you talk about whey, we used to have some farmers that we'd pick up 2 cans of milk and they'd had about 5 barrels of whey. But that's what we had to do. That was the way to get rid of the whey.
Yeah, the problem with whey was it wouldn't go away.
Nice.
Oh,
Dave?
What year the condenser closed down, do you know?
I believe it was 1964.
Where was that?
That was on the west side of Sturgeon Bay by the railroad tracks. I think Rowan Salvage took it over, pretty sure.
I'll give you a case about that. My dad sent milk to the Golden Coal factory of 51. Then he did, like you said, the condenser area. And then it was pretty well, he went out of business after the condenser area closed because he couldn't find a market for his milk after that happened.
Yeah, the condensery really affected the Door County dairy scene. A few of the cheese factories started back up again. Well, it's a long story. After the war was over, then the condensery had way too much milk. They didn't know what to do with it. So they actually started up some of these little cheese factories again and started making cheese on the side that nobody was supposed to know about. Any other questions?
How many pounds of cheese would one of those small factories produce?
Well, when they first started, it was always 2,000 pounds of milk a day. That
But that's milk. How much cheese?
1 pound for every 10,
For 200?
so 200. So the goal was to hit 2,000 pounds a day or more. That seemed to be the break-even point to be able to pay off the machinery.
Where did they market it?
To the cheese brokers, Polly & Polly, Straubel, Algoma Produce Company. As a matter of fact, Joseph Alsberger, when he got out of the cheese making business, he became a buyer for Algoma Produce Company. Any other questions? Yes, Dave.
Don, when you talked about the quality of the milk and the cheese, you said licensed cheesemakers. When did Wisconsin start requiring a license for cheesemakers? Do you know?
Well, Wisconsin was the first state in the country to require a licensed cheesemaker to be on site whenever cheese was made, and I believe it was 1896. And then we were talking about the quality of milk and being watered and whatever else. The problem was so bad that the University of Wisconsin developed a Babcock test for butterfat, and then the cheese factory started paying on butterfat, so that way if you watered your milk, you didn't get paid for it very well. Yes, sir.
My ignorance of agriculture will be evident probably by the question, but can you say anything more about what happened to the pea, production? The soil was bad, the infestation of the bugs came, and that ended it all.
Well, what happened was, it's like the golden goose. People were planting peas on peas on peas, and then the thistle problem became so bad that the peas would hardly grow anymore and the ground would get hard. Another problem with peas that most people don't realize is peas are mature in 60 days. So if you don't plant a cover crop, after that's over, the ground is bare for 300 days of the year, which means you lose a lot of fertility to soil erosion, and the ground becomes harder and harder, and you lose organic matter, and it just fed itself until there was no pea industry left anymore. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So what was your total count of factories and how many are still operating?
Well, there's one that has been in business all these years, which is Renard's on the county line going to Algoma. And then there's the Door County Artisan cheese that just started up in 2017. And the Sister Bay Creamery, which just started up in 2014, I believe.
And how many historic ones have you found?
I think I'm up to 71 or 72. Which is kind of amazing for a small county like Door County. Carl?
What did they get for a pound of cheese? And how much did a farmer get for 100 pounds of milk?
Well, for a long time, the farmers were getting anywhere from 60 cents to 80 cents, 100. That was probably for 20 or 30 years. And apparently there wasn't a rate of inflation or like there is now. But and that price would go up and down depending on how much milk was produced, depending on how much rain there was. So as far as the price of cheese, I honestly don't know what that number was. Yes, sir.
We all know we're here in the dairy state. Do you think that the history of cheese production throughout the rest of the state would sort of follow the pattern that you described?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Cheese making was very seasonal to begin with. And then when silos were introduced and alfalfa was introduced, then cows became more important. One thing I'd like to mention is we notice all these big, beautiful barns, many of which are still standing in Door County. Most of those barns were paid for by peas. They weren't paid for by the dairy herd. And a lot of times they were paid for with cash. They weren't even mortgaged, or they didn't get loans because peas were so profitable. My dad told me that his grandpa told him that they put an addition onto the barn for a milking addition, and they doubled the size of the threshing floors for $800. And their pea check was $800 for that year.
We kind of peed away their profits, in other words.
They made a mistake and invested in farming. George?
Don, up until about 10 or 12 years ago, the Green Bay area was known as the cheese capital of the world, and the national price of cheese was set by the price in Green Bay. And after California got to be a big producer, that switched to California. But if you remember, the Pauly and Pauly Cheese Company was a major market for cheese in the United States, and that set the price for the country. The other thing I read, but I don't remember the date, in some survey that was made, there were, at that particular time, there was 1,000 farmers and 8,000 cows in Door County. So the herds were kind of small.
Yeah, I would say there was a lot of people that shipped 2 cans of milk a day.
Do you know how many varieties of cheese were made? Was it all similar variety? It's not like we have it today.
It was, to begin with, it was almost all cheddar.
Okay.
And it was raw milk cheese, it wasn't pasteurized. So it had to be stored for 60 days to give the bacteria a chance to do its work and make sure that the cheese was wholesome. To get rid of the bad bacteria, the good bacteria overcame the bad bacteria.
So when did they start moving to more variety? Do you know?
That's a good question. I think when they had satisfied the demand for cheddar cheese, they got into ethnic cheeses like mozzarella, and Colby was invented in Colby, Wisconsin, and Monterey Jack. I think the industry looked for more varied and different tastes to try to make a bigger market.
But were there ethnic cheeses like German, people bring German cheese recipes here, or?
Well, the Swiss were probably the most famous for that. Swiss cheese, Limburger cheese,
Right.
that's all Swiss recipes.
I mean, would that have varied by where you were in the county? Because northern doors more, I think, Scandinavian. Certain areas are more German. Have you noticed, or have you researched that?
I haven't researched that.
That'd be interesting.
Can't tell you the answer to that. Any other questions? Thank you very much.